On the morning of December 17, 1903, history was made off the sands of Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. For the first time in history, man had achieved controlled flight of a heavier-than-air machine. The Wright brothers had achieved what all their predecessors had only dreamed of: flight. While many of their contemporaries had focused on very complicated designs, the Wrights chose a straightforward design as a means of accomplishing flight. Controlling the aircraft was a key area most designers took for granted. This is where the Wright brothers targeted most of their design and innovation. Most early inventors thought that flight control can be achieved by a pilot simply shifting his weight back and forth. The Wrights, on the other hand, knew that controlling the plane would be the key to successful flight. To find out how the Wrights accomplished the goal of flight, I spoke with Jim Cross to find out how it works.
Well, it started when they were both pretty young. In fact, at the time they were living in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. So they didn't always live in Dayton, even though that's where they considered their home to be, Dayton, Ohio. Their father was a minister. In fact, he was a bishop in his church, and he would take long trips away from home. When he would come back, he'd often bring the boys a gift. Well, one time he came back from a trip, and he walked into the room and had something in his hand. And when he opened his hand to show him what it was, it flew out of his hand. Now, what he had brought him was a little helicopter, I guess is what you'd call it today. But at that point, Orville was only 7 years old at the time, Wilbur was 11. That seed of flight was planted, and it never left them. They really just started sort of as enthusiasts and hobbyists, but when they got started on it, they knew before they did anything, they were going to have to learn everything they could on it. In 1896, they decided that they were going to get involved and take an active part in trying to solve this problem of flight. Now, they were in their 20s at the time, young men, owned a bicycle shop, the Wright Cycle Company right there in Dayton. But what really propelled them was the death of Otto Lilienthal. Now, he was a great German glider pilot. He had made thousands of glider flights. When the Wrights heard of this, they took a look at this and they said, you know, how is this possible? How could he possibly have something go so wrong that it could cause an accident that he could lose his life in? And at that moment, they decided that they wanted to maybe get involved to see if they could figure this out. At first, they didn't have this idea of they're going to go out and invent an airplane. Their initial idea was simply to study the problem, to learn everything about it they could, and what their hope was to be able to come up with possibly some little tidbit of information that they could add to this body of knowledge that man was accumulating. And then they figured someday somebody's going to put it together and figure this out.
The Wright brothers recognized early on that the pilot would have a very limited range of motion in which he could shift his weight. They realized that a pilot would become fatigued quickly if he was constantly adjusting his weight to control the craft. They understood that movable surfaces would be the only way a plane could be controlled. Wilbur Wright came up with the solution quite by accident. As he was talking with a customer in the bicycle shop, he was fidgeting with a small cardboard box. As he twisted the box back and forth in his fingers, he realized the same principle could be used on an aircraft's wings. This idea came to be known as wing warping, allowing the control they've been looking for. They tested the idea on a kite glider and were pleased to see how well it worked. With this discovery, the brothers were well on their way to solving the mystery of flight.
The Wright Cycle Company right there in Dayton was really a key. A bicycle at the time, late 1800s, was cutting-edge technology. Now, a bicycle is an unstable piece of machinery. If you just get on it and sit there, you're going to fall off. Now, even if you start riding it, if you want to turn, you can't simply turn that handlebar. But if you lean a little into that turn and then turn the handlebar a little, you're making the turn. Same thing with an airplane, they figured. So control was the key. That's what they were going for.
In the fall of 1900, the brothers tested their first glider design on the Windy Dunes here at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. Although the test flights were somewhat successful, the aircraft needed more design modifications. For the next 3 years, the brothers would leave Dayton for a few months out of the year to test their new designs at Kitty Hawk. In the late summer of 1902, the brothers finally had a glider that worked well.
But that was a turning point for the Wrights. At that point, they were no longer hobbyists. They were no longer enthusiasts. They were now true scientists and engineers. They had entered a whole new realm.
All that was left to do was find an adequate engine and propeller system, and they felt that they would soon be flying. Unfortunately, automobile engines of the time were not up to their exacting standards, so in typical Wright fashion, they hired their friend Charles Taylor to make an engine especially suited for their needs.
The engine weighed 180 pounds, and it gave them 12 horsepower. That's 50% more than they needed. So they had that engine. Now that was a 4-cylinder, gasoline-powered, water-cooled engine. I mean, it worked great.
With the engine problem solved, they looked to the propeller. For years, the Wright brothers assumed that the propeller would be the easiest problem to solve on the aircraft. Their original design was based on a ship's propeller, but they ultimately found that this design was not sufficient for their needs.
The Wrights were the first ones to figure out that a propeller for an aircraft truly needs to be a rotary wing, something that can create lift. And you just rotate that 90 degrees, you got thrust.
After months of tackling complex mathematics and theoretical physics, the brothers designed their own propellers.
Now, they hand-made these propellers out of laminated spruce. They put all of this together on the craft, and when they were done, they had a unique piece of machinery, something that could do what no other machine in the world had ever done before. They were confident of that, they knew it, but they had yet to prove it.
After winning a coin toss to decide who would try first, Wilbur climbed into the plane December 14, 1903. Unfortunately, this first flight attempt failed, causing minor damage to the plane. So 3 days later, after repairs had been made, it was Orville's turn to attempt flight.
Now, as they were getting ready to launch that craft, Orville and Wilbur kind of went to one side and had a little short conversation. The witnesses said when they left, they shook hands like two people that may never see each other again. Now they come back, he gets on board that craft, lays down in that pilot position there. Now Wilbur's got to take his place out on the wing. They're ready to go. Orville releases that wire and that craft starts down the rail. Wilbur's running along, holding on to that wing, keeping up just fine until at 10:35 in the morning, 17 December 1903, it lifts into the air. And for the first time in the history of the world, we have controlled, powered flight. First flight, 12 seconds, only went 120 feet. But it was truly the first controlled, powered flight by man. Now they made 3 more flights that day, total of 4 flights, and they alternated. Wilbur made the 4th and the longest flight. The 3rd flight was only 200 feet, but the 4th flight was 852 feet in 59 seconds. That really proved it to the world that they had really done it. What have we seen since then? I mean, we got a space station in orbit right now. I mean, we put a man on the moon. We have literally come from Wilbur's footprints in the sand right here to Neil Armstrong's footprints on the moon. Now, when Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, he had with him, had it tucked inside a spacesuit, he had a small patch of cloth from that original Wright Brothers 1903 powered flyer. And I can think of no finer tribute to the Wrights than that.
That's all from the Wright Memorial. I'm out of here. Oh, but before I go, did you know that Orville Wright was not only the first person to fly, but he was also involved in the first fatal aircraft accident? The first person killed in an airplane accident was Lieutenant Thomas E. Selfridge. On September 17, 1908, airplane inventor Orville Wright took Lieutenant Selfridge up on a demonstration flight for the U.S. Army. During the flight, one of the propellers separated, causing Wright to lose control. The plane fell 75 feet to the ground, killing Lieutenant Selfridge, while Orville Wright suffered a broken leg and pelvis.